Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie, and this is episode number 1011 for July 2nd, 2023. Coming up in a few minutes.
If you think about it as a triad, isn't it? There's a farmer, there's a malt house, and then there's the end users, brewery or distilleries. And historically, that has gone directly, that the end user, like Copperworks, goes to the malt house, and the malt house has its contract with farmers. We're now reaching out directly to the farmers and saying, how you doing?
Last week, we reported on the closing of Skagit Valley Malting, one of the leading craft maltsters in the Pacific Northwest. The malting house supplied more than 270 distilleries and breweries in the region with malted barley, and its closing leaves a huge hole in their supply chains. I'll talk with Jason Parker and Jeff Kanof of Copperworks Distilling in Seattle, one of the distilleries hit hardest by the closing, and with Kate Bernot, who covered the closing for the website Good Beer Hunting. It's a cautionary tale for the hundreds of craft distillers in the U.S., because they face a lot of the same problems Skagit Valley Malting did. I'll also have the What I'm Tasting This Week department, behind the label, and much more. The news is next on this week's WhiskyCast.
How about a really great 12-year-old Scotch whiskey? I have a stellar recommendation coming up for you in just a minute. Spoiler alert, it's Dewar's 12-year-old.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
Ever wondered where Redbreast got its name? Well, let's go back to 1912 and be glad our bird-watching founder didn't spot the bar-tailed godwit that day.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
Let's get started with the week's news. It's brought to you by the Dalmore. 8 new members of the Kentucky Bourbon Hall of Fame will be inducted this September during the Kentucky Bourbon Festival. The class of 2023 was announced this week, and it's led by Jerry Dalton, the former master distiller for Jim Beam, and the only Beam master distiller who isn't a member of the Beam family. He was the subject of an online video earlier this year titled, quote, Get Jerry Dalton in the Kentucky Bourbon Hall of Fame.
It's an honor I never anticipated. I never really even thought about it in those years that it was isolated from the business. And I'm surprised, amazed, and delighted.
How much of it do you think was the result of that film?
I can't imagine it happening at all if it hadn't been for the film. I might be wrong because Fred Noe, I don't know if you know, but Fred Noe was the guy who nominated me. And I think it would have hit Fred sooner or later. Hey, wait, how come I don't see him at these things?
What does it mean to you to have Fred nominate you?
Oh, a lot. I just can't say how much the Noe family, Booker and Annis, and Fred and Sandy, over the years, they've really been just tremendous help in everything I do. So have Fred nominate me is just really, really a super bonus as far as I'm concerned.
Other inductees include Michter's CEO Joseph Magliocco, Chet and Trey Zeller, the father and son team behind Jefferson's Bourbon, former Louisville Mayor Greg Fisher, longtime bourbon industry veteran and consultant Pete Kamer, and Louisville bar owner and activist Dixie Sherman DeMuth. More on her later on. Woodford Reserve is experimenting with rye, not as a rye whiskey version of Woodford yet, but the brand is teaming up with the University of Kentucky and local farmers on research to increase rye production in the state. Rye is used as a cover crop in between corn and soybean harvests to protect the soil, but it traditionally doesn't grow well enough to make it commercially viable. For that reason, Woodford has traditionally sourced its rye from Canada and Europe, but master distiller Elizabeth McCall wants to change that.
So this rye project has been one that we've been doing for 5 years and learned a lot, but we realized recently that we want to take a deeper dive to better understand soil health, water health, so the impacts of rye from sustainability, and then also how to best grow it. and look for an open sourced rye, which there's so many different kind of tentacles to this project. And Woodford, we're involved just as an end user and looking at it from a flavor standpoint and quality of grain that we're receiving in, but there's such a bigger impact when you look at how rye behaves from a sustainability lens. So we've kind of gotten involved in it very deeply due to just Dentra Fund work. So that's a board that I'm on. So it has a lot. I'm very passionate about it because it has so much weight and impact, and it'll be great for Kentucky too.
Kentucky is not known as a rye growing state, though.
No, so our climate is not conducive to growing rye, and so that's been a big challenge because we are so humid and hot here, and rye typically grows in a much cooler climate. It doesn't do well when we hit our 90-degree temperatures, so it's a juggling act of figuring out how early do we plant it to line up with kind of corn and soybeans. Those are the biggest crops here. So helping farmers figure out how we fit it into their crop rotation, and then making sure we can harvest it like in July, and hopefully before it gets too hot here in Kentucky. But then also finding varieties that can handle the heat is another kind of caveat to this project as well.
Now, what are you going to be doing with the grain that you're buying from the farmers in this trial?
So there's two sides to this trial that we're doing. We're doing one in partnership with the University of Kentucky, and one of their professors that works on genetics of seeds. And so he is trying to identify, we're looking at flavor. So we're going to do small distillation trials at our pilot plant at Brown-Forman headquarters in Louisville, where we will get in 10 different varieties to just look at how does the flavor develop. And those are both hybrid and open sourced, just to get a good baseline of data and understanding. Then we have 4 farmers. 2 of them have been identified. We're still waiting to hear back from our other 2 farmers on if they're going to be committed or not. But we'll have 4 farmers that we work with to grow rye, and we're going to focus more on the agronomics of that. And so how do we grow rye? When's the best time to plant? What types of fertilizers, if any, are needed? And then also looking at studying the soil health and any water system around that farm. And then we'll take that rye and we'll use that in production at Woodford Reserve to produce our bourbon with. So our grain recipe is 72% corn, 18% rye, 10% malted barley. So we'll fold it into our bourbon recipe at 18% rye.
Do you expect any flavor differences in Kentucky rye versus, say, Canadian rye?
So based on what we have already learned, we are not expecting a significant flavor impact, especially past the point of maturation. So we did find that there was some very threshold minimal flavor differences at new make. So before we see the barrel introduced, but once we did some maturation studies, we haven't found where it's been a significant shift in flavor that your average consumer would be able to pick that up. And so that's been kind of controversial in a sense that we want it to be something we can fold into our product and utilize as part of kind of diversifying our supply chain and not having a flavor difference. But then could we possibly identify varieties that do have a flavor difference and then could be seen as more of an heirloom varietal or something that would be unique, not just a commodity, but something that we could charge a higher price for, that farmers could charge more for to give your whiskey a unique Kentucky flavor.
Woodford Reserve is committed to buying all of the rye farmers in the pilot project grow for the next 5 years. In other news, there's a change in leadership at the Glenmorangie Company. Thomas Moradpour is moving within the LVMH empire to take over the reins at Dom Perignon Champagne, following 5 successful years at Glenmorangie. Casper McRae is moving into the CEO spot at Glenmorangie after serving as Global Marketing and Business Development Director. We've known Casper for years here at WhiskyCast and have no doubt that he'll do a great job in his new role. Also on the business front, Edrington announced its annual earnings this week with a 43% increase in pre-tax profits through the end of March compared to the same period a year ago. Revenue growth outpaced volume increases, indicating that a higher percentage of sales came from the premium end of the portfolio, which includes the Macallan and Highland Park. And Kentucky is getting another distillery. Former Peerless Distilling Master Distiller Caleb Kilburn and former Peerless executive Cordell Lawrence have announced plans to open Eastern Light Distilling in eastern Kentucky's Rowan County. The $144 million project will produce its own bourbon, as well as supplying other brands as a contract distiller. Diageo is facing a lawsuit over whiskey fungus in Scotland. A Stirling couple has fought off a bid by Diageo to dismiss their lawsuit over staining on their house near the Diageo Maturation Complex in Bonnybridge. The couple claims the value of their property has fallen by at least 10%, and they've worn out 3 pressure washers cleaning the fungus off their home. Meanwhile, Glenmorangie is facing a similar complaint over its maturation warehouses in the town of Brora. A complaint was filed with Brora Community Council by residents who blame ethanol emissions from the warehouses for the fungus on their homes. Glenmorangie bought the warehouses last December after leasing the site for several years, and the Community Council plans to ask Highland Council to enforce requirements that Glenmorangie clean its buildings at the site. A company spokesperson told the Northern Times the buildings will be added to a regular cleaning schedule going forward. In other news, Bollywood actor Sanjay Dutt is getting into the whiskey business. He's launched a Scotch whiskey brand called the Glenwalk. It's a 3-year-old blend produced in Scotland and designed to take advantage of India's passion for Scotch whiskey. Chivas Brothers is launching a new edition of Chivas Regal in the travel retail market. It's finished in Irish whiskey casks from Middleton Distillery. It's a 13-year-old blend that will be available globally. There's no word on pricing. Wild Turkey is releasing this year's Master's Keep bourbon. It's a 10-year-old bourbon finished in Jamaican rum casks. It's a collaboration between Eddie Russell and Appleton Estates' Dr. Joyce Spence, and will carry a recommended retail price of $275 a bottle. Beam Suntory is releasing the year's second batch of Booker's bourbon. This batch is named the Apprentice Batch in honor of Booker No's early work learning distillation from his cousin Carl Beam. It's available now with a recommended retail price of $89.99 a bottle. I'll have my tasting notes for it later on. Compass Box and London's Bimber Distillery have teamed up on a unique duet of whiskies. Duality features whiskies from the Compass Box warehouses with Bimber's own whiskies. The Compass Box Duality release takes Ardbeg and blends it with Bimber's PX Sherry Matured Single Malt, while the Bimber edition uses its whiskey taken from a peated ex-bourbon cask and blends it with First Fill Sherried Malt from Glendullan Distillery. The Bimber Duality release will carry a recommended retail price in the UK of £120, while the Compass Box Duality release will cost £180 a bottle. You can keep up on the latest whiskey news all week long at whiskycast.com and in the WhiskyCast community app. The news is brought to you by the Dalmore.
Hello, Richard Patterson here, Master Distiller, Master Blender for the Dalmore. You know, whenever the team and I are in the world sharing our exceptional single malt, we like to keep in touch with Mark Gillespie and the latest news from WhiskyCast.
Time now for our look at upcoming whiskey events around the world. The calendar is brought to you by Writer's Tears. Sagamore Spirit Distillery's next Whiskey on the Waterfront party is coming up on July 15th. Belfast Whiskey Week kicks off on the 21st and runs through July 29th. Whiskey Live Sydney is July 21st and 22nd in Sydney, Australia. Tales of the Cocktail is July 23rd through the 28th in New Orleans, Louisiana. The Whiskey Show takes place August 5th in Melbourne, Australia, and Tasmania Whiskey Week starts on August 7th and runs through the 13th. If you're organizing a whiskey event, let us know about it. We'll add it to the calendar at whiskycast.com and in the WhiskyCast community app. The calendar is brought to you by Writer's Tears.
Writer's Tears Copperpot, an 18th century style of premium Irish whiskey, blended from single pot still and single malt. Like yourself, it's one of life's treasured rarities, and what's rare is wonderful. Writer's Tears Copperpot.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
So, in Spain, they call redbreast Petit Roco. It's me, but a touch more exotic. Kind of like a Redbreast PX edition. Finished in Pedro Jimenez casks, adding a velvety and decadent dimension. You know, I won't lie. A climate like this makes me wish I was a migratory bird.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
WhiskyCast In-Depth is brought to you by Mortlach and the Classic Malts lineup. Washington State's Skagit Valley Malting closed its doors suddenly a couple of weeks ago after the owners decided to file for bankruptcy. At the time, the craft malt house had more than 270 brewing and distillery clients around the Pacific Northwest who have now been left in the lurch. That list includes Copperworks Distilling in Seattle. I talked with founders Jason Parker and Jeff Kanof this week. Guys, tell me first of all what the impact is on Copperworks of Skagit Valley Malting's closing down.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, Mark. It's twofold. There's the immediate input or impact, I should say, which is products that we have been buying from them are no longer available. So things like peated malt, single farm varieties, single vintage of the same variety from the same farm but different year. These programs that we've put together over the years that had been closely coupled with Skagit Valley's releases, Skagit Valley Malting's releases, are on the hold until whatever happens in the future happens. So that could be nothing, or it could be something rises from the ashes. That's what we're all hoping.
How much of your barley were you getting from them?
Depends on the year. Some years 50%, and then when main stem malt came on and link malting got a little bit bigger, about a third of the malt. None of the malt that we were buying was coming from Great Western Malting in the past 6 years. We've been buying 100% Washington and trying to move to smaller and smaller farms where we knew the farmers, we knew the farmer's name, we knew the varieties and the crop rotation that they were working with. So this is a big difference. We'll have to move back to some of the bigger ones.
And when we talk about the peated product, there's no alternative that's similar to that. So when it comes to that product, 100% of that was coming from Skagit Valley Malting.
How do you replace this then?
Well, we won't. I mean, we will replace it if it is replaceable with another malt house or a reopening of a version of Skagit Valley Malting, and they want to continue to do that product. So that's the world of supply and demand, right? Is we have to take advantage of what's here, and when it's not here, we find something else to do.
Will this reduce your commitment anyway to local farmers and trying to source as locally as possible?
Actually, quite the opposite. So what it's caused us to do is yesterday I had to reach out directly to farmers who were, if you think about it, it's a triad, isn't it? There's a farmer, there's a malt house, and then there's the end users, brewery or distilleries. And historically, that has gone directly, that the end user like Copperworks goes to the malt house, and the malt house has its contract with the farmers. We're now reaching out directly to the farmers and saying, how you doing? We know you have your spring crop coming off the field right now, and we know that you probably were intending to sell that to Skagit Valley Malting, and they're closed. So if you need to make a commitment to another malt house and know that you have some customers, we'd be interested in talking to you about that. So some of the farmers that we've worked with over the past 8 years are going to be in that boat. And we'd be happy to learn what their options are and see if we can help them.
What are the chances you think that somebody will either buy Skagit Valley Malting out of a bankruptcy court or find a way to reopen it somehow?
Boy, here's my thoughts. 100%. Right? It's not that it's too big to fail. It's important. It's too important to fail. Why does it exist? It exists because Skagit Valley farmers, which are very small property owners, right? They're not 5,000 acre, they're 100 acre farms. These small farmers have been planting cover crops because crop rotation is so important for their process. Break disease cycles, break pest cycles. That whole process was being plowed under as just organic material. And the Skagit Valley Malting belief was that we can add value to those farmers by having a cover crop become a non-commodity, but a value add crop. And that's what farmers there need. They need that product to actually have a market value. And that's still a need. That is, there are still so many farmers up there that need that help. Skagit Valley Malting is there and is ready and has built out the tools, the grain handling, the storage, the process, has shown the demand. I believe it will have to happen. It's just a matter of who and when.
Yeah, and it's not just that the farmers know they need that. It's that entire region, is based on farming. And so the authorities and powers that be in that region know how important that was for the farmers in the community.
Have you heard of any other distilleries that are being affected by this other than Westland?
Well, yeah, quite a few of the small distilleries and breweries that we know are buying from them. We got a email from Woodinville Whiskey yesterday. They don't buy malted barley from them, but they were wondering what the impact would be to us and to other places. So high side distilling, a little bit of Ula distilling. I don't think Dry Fly Distilling was buying from them. I think they were buying from Link Malting because they're in the region. But there's 110 distilleries in Washington State, and everybody who was trying to commit to local was impacted.
Now, the closing of one malt house isn't a trend, but Skagit Valley Malting isn't the only one to close its doors or be put up for sale in the last year. Craft malt houses have a lot in common with craft distillers. They're capital-intensive businesses that require a lot of investment and generate low profit margins. So that begs the question, is this a sign of bigger problems to come? Kate Bernot has been covering the craft malting closings for the website Good Beer Hunting, and we talked this week on a Zoom call. Tell me about what led to the Skagit Valley Malting's closing and why this is so significant.
Well, I can't pretend that I know everything about what happened, certainly. I think there's still a lot of questions about, internal sort of financial decisions at that company that us outsiders can't quite know at this point. But what we do know is that they closed rather abruptly. A couple of weeks ago, it came as quite a shock even to the employees of the malting facility. There are about 18 employees. It also came as a shock to the 270 odd brewery and distillery suppliers that relied on Skagit Valley Malt for all, in some cases, or a portion of their malted grains. And it came as a shock, I think, to many in the broader craft malt industry who were pretty surprised to see a significant player and one of the largest craft malt houses in the Pacific Northwest closed abruptly. And I think, that on face is a big deal. But I think the way that industry reacted is a little bit twofold. It had some people asking, "Oh no, does this spell trouble for craft malt as a whole? Should we read this as some sign of storm clouds brewing for this whole industry?" And there were a lot of maltsters and their distillery and brewery partners who stepped in to say, no, this is an isolated business that, from what my reporting shows, was not operating at its full production capacity, even as it was in the midst of a significant $11 million expansion project. And they're quick to say that does not bode ill for craft malt as a whole. This is one isolated company. We shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, I guess, as it were.
To use another cliche, this is not the canary in the coal mine.
I don't think this is an indictment of craft malt as a whole by any means. And I say that because the demand is there. Many of the craft maltsters that I'm talking to are selling everything they make. That said, it is a relatively capital-intensive business that runs on pretty low margins. It's also an agricultural product, like a very deeply agricultural product, which is always subject to the whims and wills of Mother Nature. So that is complicated. So, of course, depending on how your business is financed and how you're structured, sometimes there's not a lot of room for error. But again, I don't think we should take that as an indictment of the health of craft malt in general.
In your article, you pointed out that there have been several craft maltsters closed down in recent months.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I believe 2 closures within maybe the last 12 months, and then a couple that are for sale or looking to bring on additional investors. And I think that what that speaks to is sort of this growth and in-between stage that a lot of craft malting businesses are in now, where they recognize the need to scale. There's certainly demand. But again, it's capital intensive. We're talking $1 million machines in some cases to expand production. And how you finance that growth is kind of everything, right? It's not a sexy story maybe, but it's a true business story of how you justify that growth, and where the money comes from can be all the difference, and how flexible your cash flow is. It's kind of just a small business story. As Scott Hickman, who's the CEO of Riverbend Malt, pointed out to me, last year 319 craft breweries closed in the United States. We don't really hear people saying that that's the end of craft brewing. No. So that was sort of his, let's not be too dramatic in the conclusions we draw. However, obviously it's a challenging industry to grow in, for sure. And a lot of craft maltsters are feeling that right now.
Have you heard anything from the farmers that are going to be affected by this in the Pacific Northwest?
Yeah, I think I haven't been able to speak to any, but there are certainly, I believe Riverbend Malt said they were contracted for 3.5 million pounds of barley at the time that they closed. So that's a significant amount of income for those farmers. And when I spoke to Garden Path Fermentations, to Ron Extract, who's the co-creator there, they're a wonderful brewery and also winemaker. They make other fermented products in the Skagit Valley. Ron really expressed that he hopes someone is able to step in and continue paying these farmers for these grains that they're growing, because local breweries and distillers want them, but farmers aren't going to keep growing them if there's not that middle buyer. So I think different areas of the industry are really wanting to keep that agricultural piece alive. It's just going to be a question of, does anyone step in to fill the void left by Skagit Valley?
I know a lot of the farmers up there had been working with Washington State University to grow heirloom varieties of barley. for people like Westland Distillery in Seattle and other craft distilleries as well as the brewers. And this is going to create a big problem because Skagit Valley was the only place malting these grains.
Pretty much. And I know Westland in particular, I believe was sourcing all of their malt from Skagit Valley. Is that your understanding?
Either all or a very significant part of it.
Yeah. And I know they haven't quite decided how they're going to make up that gap. I checked in with them today just in case, and they didn't really have an answer yet. And I think that, that's indicative of the bind that these farmers are in, that distillers will be in, and that brewers will be in. Again, even if another maltster were to kind of step in and try to fill that void, we're talking about a perishable agricultural product that grows with the seasons, right? The stuff doesn't stay good forever. It needs to be processed. It needs to come out of the ground. It needs to be put into the ground. So, time is really of the essence when we're talking about an agricultural product like this.
Give me a sense of the economics of scale or the economies of scale that these maltsters are dealing with.
Yeah, that's that is like the $1 million billion question to this whole industry, because there's an advantage to staying perhaps very small and keeping your overhead low. And I mean, I know some very small malting operations like Mecca grade estate malt, which is literally an estate malt. They malt the barley they grow on their farm, which is like an incredible vertical supply chain. And what a beautiful product to offer to brewers and distillers, right? Something that has such traceability and such a story and ownership there. But for example, that's a family run operation. I mean, with a handful, maybe 2 to 5 employees. And they're looking to expand because malt for brewing and distilling in the US has been a commodity for most of like the contemporary industry, right? To this day, craft maltsters kind of have to plead their case to, I think, at least on the brewing side. I'd be curious how you see this from the distilling side, but when you can buy barley for, in some cases, half as much from a commodity barley supplier, even if you believe in your heart as a brewer in this local ag movement, to fork over 1.5 to 2 times as much can be hard to swallow, even if you kind of want to do it. So the more that these craft maltsters are able to grow, the more they're able to create efficiencies and more consistency also sometimes in their product, which is another kind of area brewers are concerned about and distillers. And if they're able to grow to a size that improves their efficiencies, then they can offer their malt at a price that's at least a little bit more competitive with commodity malt. And we're seeing that now as the prices for imported European malt have risen over the last year, that craft malt is able to make a little bit more of a dollars and cents pitch to some of those brewers and distillers to say, hey, it's still a premium, but the gap is closing. Give us a shot. We're local. We don't charge an arm and a leg for freight like imported malt does. And you can tell this really nice story about local agriculture. So those are the reasons to expand again, but then you're taking on some really intense capital burdens to do it in some cases.
And this is not a profit-laden industry, is it?
If you are going into craft malting to make a quick buck, I have a lot of questions for you. Again, not to say that this industry can't work, far from it. It's just not like a get rich quick industry in that way. I mean, very little in agriculture is. So I think it's, you know, people who are doing it and doing it well and being successful are really creating organic growth, growing, but growing modestly, slowly, organically, and financing their expansions carefully. And they'll be the ones that are more stable in the long term.
I know that Skagit Valley had a lot of investment from private equity and venture capital, and they expect returns much greater and much faster than what a malting house can supply generally, right?
Yeah, and you'd think that if you're putting money into an industry as a private equity firm or as some kind of wealth management professional, you would have that timeline in mind. But and again, my instinct says that was a piece of what was happening here. But yeah, usually those PE folks want a pretty quick return, and especially if you're financing a big expansion, they might just not have had that cash flow to return. So yeah, I think that was likely a piece of it.
We'll find out when the bankruptcy filing hits the courts.
Oh yeah, that'll be some spicy reading for the 10 people in the world who have interest in that kind of thing.
I think it's more than 10.
There are dozens of us.
No, because I've gotten a bunch of reaction since we just reported the basics of Skagit Valley closing, and people wondering whether this is a sign of problems in craft distilling, because the distillers have to rely on malt.
Sure.
And they can't really... Go ahead.
Do you feel, though, that especially the growing interest in American single malt whiskey almost necessitates, I mean, it is predicated on a really high quality, differentiated malted grain supply chain. I mean, the consumer demand is there. The distiller and brewer demand seems to be there. We just got to make the economics of that middleman work.
I think it's going to have a problem for American single malts, just because if you can't get the malt to make the whiskey and you're a small scale distiller, if we have more closings like this, there are going to be problems in supply down the road.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And distillers have enough problems right now just trying to keep profits at minimal levels while they let their stock age.
Sure. Yeah, this also seems to be a story of time and of the cycles of agriculture and sales and cash flow, and how all of those sort of work together or don't sometimes, which again makes these kind of discussions really fascinating, because you have many moving parts. And again, like agriculture is fickle and not the most profitable thing in the entire world.
As for Westland Distillery, I received this email from distillery manager Tyler Peterson this week. Here's what he had to say. Skagit Valley Malting has been a longtime partner, and we're saddened by the news of their business challenge. They have been pioneers in the craft malt industry and invaluable partners in the effort to showcase the amazing flavors of barley from the Pacific Northwest. We are grateful to have worked with such talented and passionate people. Nevertheless, establishing resilient supply chains and developing a strong local grain economy has always been foundational to Westland. By forging strong relationships with our many regional suppliers over the years, we have had the opportunity to develop some exceptional whiskies that we look forward to sharing in the coming years. So while we will miss working with the team at SVM, we feel confident about our ability to navigate this challenge. That's WhiskyCast In-Depth, brought to you by Mortlach, whiskey's best-kept secret. Hidden away for decades in some of the world's most famous Scotch whiskies, comes a single malt inspired by an original for a fortunate few. Discover the entire Mortlach lineup at malts.com. Let's start off the What I'm Tasting This Week department with the Square 6 Wheated Bourbon from Heaven Hill's Evan Williams Bourbon Experience. It's distilled on the micro distillery setup at the Bourbon Experience on Whiskey Row in downtown Louisville and bottled at 47.5% ABV. The nose has touches of caramel candy, soft oak, fresh tree fruits, and vanilla. The taste is fruity and spicy with a nice balance of apples, peaches, white pepper, caramel, vanilla, and honey. The finish, long and subtle with dried fruits and a hint of spice. I'm scoring the Square 6 Wheated Bourbon from Heaven Hill a 92. Next up, the year's second batch of Booker's Bourbon. As I mentioned earlier, the Apprentice batch gets its name from Booker No's time as an apprentice distiller under the tutelage of his cousin Carl Beam. It's bottled at 62.75% ABV, and the nose has touches of vanilla pods, caramel candy, dried fruits, and honey. The taste is thick and oily with spicy touches of black pepper and cinnamon, along with dried fruits, honey, and vanilla. The finish is long and spicy with a touch of dried fruits, and I'm scoring Booker's Bourbon Batch 2023-02, the Apprentice Batch, a 90. Now let's look at a Japanese whiskey, the Hakata 18-year-old, distilled at the Hikari Distillery in Fukuoka, Japan. It's matured in sherry casks and bottled at 42% ABV. The nose has notes of cooked fruits, raisins, and plums. The taste is thick, spicy, and mouth-filling, with notes of cooked fruits, white pepper, ginger, and touches of raisins and plums. The finish is long with lingering fruits, spices, and a touch of beefiness. I'm scoring the Hakata 18-year-old an 89. And finally, Amrut's Liberty is a U.S.-exclusive bottling that blends Amrut's standard single malt along with its single rye malt and Indian grain whiskies. It's bottled at 46% ABV, and the nose is aromatic with baking spices, honey, caramel, dried apple chips, and is slightly dry and dusty. The taste is peppery and intense with black pepper, curry powder, a hint of mint leaves, honey, caramel, and red apples. The finish is long and spicy with a hint of red apples, and I'm scoring Amrut's Liberty a 91. I'm adding these tasting notes to our searchable list of more than 3,500 different whiskeys from all over the world. Check it out this week at whiskycast.com.
Gabriel here. The new Dewar's 12-year-old has been completely remastered to be richer, smoother, and more balanced. It's a total winner. It's double-aged in first-fill premium bourbon casks for greater depth and breadth of flavor, with notes of apples, lemon zest, and spicy and floral notes with a long, smooth vanilla finish. The experts agree too. It's winning awards like pros sink putts. In fact, WhiskyCast's own Mark Gillespie gave it a 94-point rating, which is pretty amazing for a 12-year-old Scotch. It's also earned a 94-point rating from Whiskey Advocate. That makes it their highest-rated 12-year-old Scotch whiskey. It's an excellent testament to the skill, craft, and refinement of the world's most awarded blended Scotch whiskey, Dewar's. Drink responsibly. Copyright 2023 Dewar's Blended Scotch Whiskey, 40% alcohol by volume.
Let's open up the inbox now for our community segment, brought to you by Waterford Whiskey. Had this comment from Twitter on the Kentucky Bourbon Hall of Fame inductees announced this week. Our colleagues at the Whiskey Lore podcast tweeted this: "Nice to see the Zellers honored. Their passion for history is greatly appreciated." Chet and Trey Zeller also become the first father and son to be inducted together as part of the same class of the Bourbon Hall of Fame. From Instagram now, I asked last week whether we're in a new golden age for Scotch whiskey, and Cars and Cubes responded, a bit tongue-in-cheek, "If by golden you mean that we need to have bullion bars in hand in order to purchase a bottle, yes," with a winking emoji. On our discussion last week with Charlie McLean and Ian Buxton, Ian Bruce posted this in the WhiskyCast community app. "What a great listen to the conversation between Ian Buxton and Charles McLean. Thank you both for sharing your knowledge and memories. Thank you, Mark, for allowing us to enjoy this wonderful chat like we were a fly on the wall." Thank you, Ian. And from Willem Killian, just listened to this week's very interesting episode. Thanks for doing this interview, Mark. Great conversation with Charlie and Ian Buxton. With all the craziness going on in the market, I can see why independent bottlers are buying or even building their own distilleries to help secure their supply. Oh, and thanks for the neat summary on caramel coloring. If chill filtration could be discussed in some detail on an upcoming episode, I'm sure that will be very interesting. Okay, we'll look at that for an upcoming Behind the Label in a future episode. Thanks, Willem. And if you have something you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, download the free WhiskyCast Community app from the Apple or Google App Stores, or check out the web-based version at whiskycast.com. With all of the changes affecting Twitter in the last few days, our app provides unfiltered, unmetered whiskey conversation with whiskey lovers just like you. We're still on Twitter for now, along with Facebook and Instagram. Just look for us at WhiskyCast, or you can email us. The address is comments@whiskycast.com. Our community segment is presented by Waterford Whiskey, where they explore the frontiers of natural flavor one farm at a time to create unique Irish whiskies. Visit them on the web at waterfordwhiskey.com. Let's close out the show now with Behind the Label, our look at the history, science, and people that make whiskey unique. Dixie Sherman DeMuth was announced as one of the 8 inductees into the Kentucky Bourbon Hall of Fame's class of 2023 this week. You've probably never heard of her, but she was a trailblazer for women in the whiskey industry. For 200 years, Kentucky had a state law banning women from working in or patronizing so-called public houses or bars until Dixie DeMuth came along. She owned Dixie's Elbow Room in Louisville and decided to fight that law in 1968. She hired an all-female staff and allowed women to drink at her bar. State regulators shut down the Elbow Room several times and fined her on other occasions. And it took 4 long years, but she finally persuaded the Kentucky Supreme Court to overturn the law in 1972. That paved the way for women in Kentucky to this day. Dixie DeMuth died in 2020 at the age of 102. Her daughters will be accepting her induction on her behalf this September. If you have something you'd like us to look at on an upcoming episode, just email us. The address is comments@whiskycast.com. That's all for this edition of WhiskyCast. You'll find links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at whiskycast.com. That's also where you'll find the latest whiskey news, my tasting notes, the calendar of events, the whiskey photo of the week, and, of course, a complete archive of past episodes that goes all the way back to 2005. Get in touch with us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at WhiskyCast, or you can use the new WhiskyCast Community app. Download it today from the Apple or Google App Stores. Our email address is comments@whiskycast.com.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
Small batch. How would you describe it? It's like an Irishman's understanding of baseball. Extremely limited.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
Find the new Dewar's 12-year-old and discover what all the awards are about. You can toast and thank me later. From Dewar's, the world's most awarded blended Scotch whiskey.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2023, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.